Hayworth had her first only child by the Prince Ali Khan, that one. She had her first child in Lausanne when I was there, who is now grown up and married, I think, in America. Rita Hayworth.
Right. Well, you also had a bit of confrontation in Monte Carlo with the Duke of Westminster.
Oh yes, the Duke of Westminster went to Monte Carlo not more than once a year, and he used to arrive on one of his he had two huge yachts, and one was called the Cutty Sark. And I can remember when he came to Monte Carlo, he spent, of course, so much money when he was there, and he was one of their best sort of customers, that although the Monaco publicity people put me up in the Hotel de Paris free twice a year, they had to make me disappear, because the Duke of Westminster gave orders that no photographer was to be anywhere near him. And when he was in a restaurant in Monte Carlo, I wasn't allowed even to photograph the other end of the room, which I thought most unfair. And I said once, not to him, but to someone with him, I said, I don't want to photograph the Duke of Westminster. I want to photograph his friends, yes, because I knew some of them. But I didn't see why I had to be banished out of the building while he was having his lunch, or it was, dinner party. And so I worked out, it was Fiona Campbell-Walter, Fiona Thyssen, who was then, I think, one of the parties he brought ashore. And I had a great idea. I said, if I just keep outside in the passage, all of you ladies will have to powder your noses, won't you? I said, if he won't allow me, the Duke won't allow me to photograph anyone, I can always photograph them going to the cloakroom. So I stationed myself outside the ladies' cloakroom, and in due course they came out, and Fiona, I think it was, used to rather help by suggesting that they should powder their noses, and the Duke didn't know, but I was terrified he'd see the flashes or something. And I got nearly all his guests, about him knowing, coming in and out of the lavatory.
Presumably you knew Fiona Thyssen.
I did indeed. She was so wonderful. No, I never knew her in those days. I only knew her later on, but she was, now talking about beauty, she had the most wonderful bones that I ever saw anybody have face. Marvellous. And I think she still has. I haven't seen her lately. Well, she was so tiresome, that Duke of Westminster, really. He was ghastly.
When you actually rather specialised in a series of careers, I'm putting this very badly, but you photographed writers, you photographed painters.
Yes, I did.
I was actually going to ask you about some of the writers that you photographed.
Yes.
Specifically, of course, Somerset Maugham.
Yes, but it's more interesting than that for the early ones.
Right, well the early ones would be...
Well, some I haven't mentioned to you.
Yes.
And before we start, let's think who the early ones were. Yes, that's one. And if you think of another... Yes, it's okay, I can remember.
Well, of the writers that you photographed,
yes,
who were the most interesting ones?
The writers I photographed, the first was someone who was called A.J. Cronin, who had only just come into the news by writing a novel called Hatter's Castle. And he, I think, was going to be a doctor originally, and he made up his mind. He said, I'm going to some island in the West Highlands to write a book. If it's a failure, I go on being a doctor. If it's a success, it'll be wonderful, I go on writing. So A.J. Cronin wrote Hatter's Castle, locked up on some island up here, and it was a great success. So he was in the news. So naturally I got in touch with Mr. Cronin, and it didn't seem to be very easy, difficult in those days. It's funny, people didn't refuse. You would have thought they wouldn't have bothered. But there was N.A.G. Strong, who no one remembers, at the same date, a bestseller. And they all said, yes, do come. So, and I was very interested, of course, in writers, naturally, because Naomi Mitchell, my cousin, and also Cronin. And then there were others who were rather glad to be photographed. But the thing was, it was very, very interesting how different people were to what you expected them to be. But let's think, yes, then there was someone called Margaret Kennedy in the early days. Margaret Kennedy was a terrific bestseller. She wrote The Constant Nymph, which went into thousands of editions. But she never really wrote a book afterwards which went so well. Well, I went to photograph Margaret Kennedy, and the door was opened by a woman carrying with a duster in her hand. So I said I'd come to, I didn't know what Margaret Kennedy looked like, evidently, that date. And she said, I am Margaret Kennedy, with the duster. And I am, because I didn't expect to find an authoress dusting the house. And so the Cronin, N.A.G. Strong, who no one remembers now, and Margaret Kennedy, who people do remember still, were the first I took, first writers.
I'm not right in thinking, I may be wrong here, A.J. Cronin wrote Dr. Finlay's casebook. Yes.
That was later.
Yes. No, I just wondered if you could mention that in the context of A.J. Cronin, because people wouldn't necessarily remember.
What's it called?
Dr. Finlay's casebook.
Yes, I don't remember that.
Well, it's actually been televised, you see.
I see.
Moving on, you went to Cap Ferrat to photograph Somerset.
Yes. When I met him before the war, when he used to come over from his villa, which I had never been to then. He came over to Monte Carlo for meals and different occasions. So I used to photograph him quite early on.
Sorry, can we start that bit again, because you were on the move when you started.
Sorry?
Just go back to the beginning of...
Yes, you said I photographed Somerset Maugham.
I photographed Somerset Maugham before the war, not in London ever, but when I was in Monte Carlo, it was one summer, and he came over from his villa at Cap Ferrat. I think it was the time that his daughter hadn't married her first husband, and so I was photographing them, and they were staying with Somerset Maugham. So I photographed them all together. Then I didn't see him at all till after the war. And then, when I was in Monte Carlo, I went over, the last time I went, he was about 89, I think, and I went over by bus, rather quite a journey, to Cap Ferrat, and then I had to walk from the bus stop all the way to the house. I really got fed up, it was rather tiring, and I thought, well, at least when I get there, I get a cup of tea. It was the afternoon. But I was feeling, and I got attacked by a terrible dog on the way. A dog rushed out at me. I was going to be, I thought, terribly bitten, so I hurled my Rolleiflexes on a long string, on a long leather string. I bashed the dog's head with the camera and hoped for the best. It really was frightening. There was no one there to help. And it was a guard dog. Anyhow, so I arrived in a rather upset state, having been attacked by a dog. And then Alan Searle, his man who looked after him, who was with him a long, long time, it was there. He knew, of course, I was coming. And he said, he put on a sort of Cockney accent sometimes. He came from somewhere on the Edinburgh Road, but he used to put on a Cockney accent. He said, I think the old boy's about at it today, so he was go gently. Because he was 89 after all, you see. And there he was. He was extraordinary. He was quite expressionless. You see, he'd been to Dr. Niehans in Switzerland, the man who started this idea of injecting people with glands, which is a great idea of rejuvenation. And I think that when some of those people went to Dr. Niehans with the treatment, it had a curious effect. It kept them alive, but their minds went. So I think Somerset Maugham was the result of Dr. Niehans keeping him alive, but he didn't quite know where he was. And he liked being photographed. It's extraordinary. He had an old-fashioned idea in his mind, evidently, that you had to keep very still for the photograph. So he used to remain motionless. And I had to tell him, I've taken it, I used to say, because he didn't relax. You see, he went on posing. He liked being, isn't it funny how those people, so famous, who'd been photographed endlessly, he loved being photographed.
What was the house like?
Oh, wonderful. It was the most beautiful villa. And the interesting thing was that Alan Searle, his companion, said to me, no one really has ever been allowed to go up to his writing room, but I think the old boy won't notice if you go. So I went upstairs on the top of the villa to his writing room. It was an extraordinary room. There was hardly any furniture, and the window looking out over the Mediterranean had been blocked up, so he wasn't distracted by the view. And he had a writing table, a very bare, uncluttered writing table, a wooden thing, a piece of furniture, and a chair looked so uncomfortable, it really looked hard as nails to sit on. The desk was so empty, there was no idea of sort of work. And that was the room he worked in. And then I came downstairs, I remember, then I began to take some more photographs, and then the time came, and I think he got a bit tired, and I had to stop. And then I saw his Rolls Royce was outside the door. And I thought, well, now I get a lift back, surely, to Monte Carlo. No lift back at all. But I did manage to get a rather large piece of cake on a rather small plate, which Adam Sell fetched from the kitchen or something. And I get no idea, he never offered you anything, let alone a cigarette.
Another writer you knew was Osbert Sitwell.
Yes, he was very, very sort of fatherly. In the war, Osbert was a great deal in London, not up at Renishaw, he was in London. And I used to go there, I went to supper sometimes. Curiously enough, although it was very exciting to think that one was in the room even with the Sitwell, I wasn't all, I think now it seems awfully exciting, but then I took it rather calmly, I suppose. I don't know. But he used to say, he was terribly kind, because at that time I was very short of money. And he said, I know all about being short of money. He said, my father made this will, and there was no money there, and I know what it is. And he said to me, well, I always would help you, if you got into difficulties. He didn't know my background at all, but I thought they were so nice. And then he had a companion who looked after him. And I used to go to supper in the house in Carlisle Square, and he had his meals. He went out to the back of the house, like through a small garden, and the dining room was off in the garden, sort of like a summer house. And we used to have supper there. I never went to any other meal except supper, I think it was. And then I loved walking down King's Road with him. I felt frightfully proud, because he was very, very sort of grand looking. And he didn't look in the least like a writer. He smoked cigars, and he didn't have, I never saw any writing table much in the house. And he was very, very prosperous looking. He looked like a prosperous businessman. And I remember walking down the King's Road, as I say, very proud of myself, hoping people would see me walking with Osbert Sitwell. And he went into a shop, and he had a cane, always walked with a cane. And he went into a shop, and there was no one there. He banged his cane on the counter. I thought it was a wonderful command. And the man came out to serve him. And then he told me wonderful ghost stories. Wonderful ghost stories. And he would tell me, when we were walking along, he'd tell me stories. But I was so foolish. I never said, could I meet Edith, your sister Edith? And I never asked. You see, I never met her.
You didn't meet Cecil?
No, because he was, and Sashi said, well, he never was in London much. But it was so silly of me. I never asked to see Edith. But I enjoyed him very much. I met him in Monte Carlo, Osbert, once or twice, too. When I was photographing him in Monte Carlo, there was a sort of prickly pear thing, a branch of a prickly pear, and he suddenly got scratched by, he said, do you think I'm going to be poisoned? He got terribly nervous, could be pricked by a prickly pear. I can remember that. He was very nervous about his health, and he smoked cigars called Romeo and Juliet. I can always remember.
Another writer that you came to know quite well later in life in Edinburgh when you settled here was Compton Mackenzie.
Oh, yes.
Place.
Compton Mackenzie in Edinburgh. Well, you see, I knew him first when I was in London, because I used to come up here a great deal. And he was wonderful in this way. He never said he couldn't see you, but he didn't say, he never made it difficult for you. But the best time to see him, I learned after I came to live here, was to see him in the mornings. Because in the morning he stayed in bed all the morning. He never had lunch. And he stayed in bed and no visitors came then. When you went, he always had an audience, you see, as a rule. He did most of his work at night, I think. But he always had a perpetual audience, so when you went, you couldn't really get close conversations because there were so many other people there. But when I went in the mornings, he was opening his letters in his room, in a four-post bed. And one morning, he threw an envelope across the bed to me, and I picked it up, and written on it, the envelope was addressed to Sir Compton Mackenzie on his island near Scotland. And it got to him here. And he was so proud of the fact that he was so well known that the letter on his island near Scotland got to Drummond Place. He was delightful. And if I said, could I bring a friend to see him, he never said no. He always made time.
This was, the last 20 years of his life when he was...
I came here in 65. I can't remember what date it was he died. But he was being filmed. He was being filmed for a series the day before he died. And he said to the men, leave your work cameras here, because they'll be ready in the morning. And he was dead in the morning.
Yeah.
So he went on, he was determined to be 100. He died he and old Lord Roseby had a sort of competition. Lord Roseby beat him, because Lord Roseby lived to be 89, he was considerably older. But Monty died at 89, he didn't get to 90.
So you've written
yes.
a book on every decade of his life.
And June realized he wrote in longhand. He didn't dictate. He wrote it in a terribly illegible handwriting. I mean, it was so illegible, I don't know how anyone ever read it. And then as he got older, his eyes went. Even when I came to live here, his eyes were going. And he got very blind in one eye, with the result that he didn't dictate, and so he had to write blind. Well, so it was that was a very cruel thing. He couldn't write very much towards the end of his life, because he just didn't dictate. He used to work in the most enormous chair, like a dentist's chair. It was a very curious contraption. But he was a wonderful, wonderful, kind person.
A great sense of humour.
A great sense of humour, yes. And terribly, when you wanted to tell him something interesting, I knew he'd met the Kaiser of Germany. I knew he'd met him. So I said, did you ever meet the Kaiser? And then he started, you see, how he'd met the Kaiser at dawn when he was in exile. And I always drew him out that way, you see, because I knew he'd met these people. And then I used to say, well, did you ever meet so-and-so? And then he'd begin. But, he was wonderful. I found his books difficult to read, you know, but I loved him talking.
Yes. And you knew him really when he was in his third marriage.
Let's think, yes. Chrissy, his wife before the last, see, he married two sisters. Lady Mackenzie, the first Lady Mackenzie was Mrs. Mackenzie. She was Christopher Stone. Who was Christopher Stone? I can't remember. To do with gramophones, wasn't he? Christopher Stone, the first wife was Christopher Stone's sister, and he had to do with gramophones in some way. I don't know what it was.
Compton Mackenzie edited the gramophone.
Right, well, because his wife, his brother-in-law, Christopher Stone, was into that sort of job about gramophones. That was it, yes. The first wife I hardly knew. I met her they separated quite early on, and he always had Chrissy, his secretary, to pour out the tea and do everything, and that was the middle wife. And Chrissy, well, she was with him for a very long time. In fact, after he left Capri, she went to work for him in the early days when he lived on one of the Channel Islands. And so Chrissy was the one I knew first. Lily, her sister, who married him later, used to do a lot of typing, I think, and she was actually working in a school in Edinburgh when I first came. But Monty he was extraordinary. What we were talking about you were asking me about the wives. Now, how did we get onto that?
I was really asking, about his wives, because of course.
Oh yes. Chrissy was She was a great, very social. Whereas Lily, his last wife, didn't care about the grand people at all. I think she's very happy today not seeing any of those people. But Chrissy was a great one for all the. He used to go around there and he found all kinds of people, interesting people in the room. And Chrissy was sort of keeping it all going. But then you see, she died very soon. She died actually before I came here, Chrissy. And then he married Lily when I was in Switzerland.
He was very involved with Scottish national politics.
Yes, I didn't remember that phase. I read about it at the time. See, he was very in the early days with the Lovett family, with the Lord Lovett of the day. He was, to this day, you see, all the Frasers were very close to him. And he had wonderful birthday parties when I came to Edinburgh. In fact, he had one here one year. And it was very exciting because I loved having him anyway. It was wonderful to have Compton Mackenzie in the house. And suddenly all the lights failed. And we had everything ready, and then all the lights went out. And even the cooker went out, everything went out. It was a drama. And luckily I had lots of candles. And but he was so blind by that time, he didn't know that lights had given out. We did it all by candlelight.
And also in Edinburgh, it was Nabokov, you met him?
Nabokov?
Yes.
No, I was in the south of France, and I'd never read the famous Lolita, which had just come out, the book which everyone read. I hadn't read it, and a great friend of mine, Mrs. Fellows, Daisy Fellows, lived at Cap Martin, near Monte Carlo, and she said at lunch to me, if you promise not to tell anyone that I've told you that Nabokov is in a flat at Beaulieu, which is just next door to Monte Carlo. He doesn't want anyone to know he's there. He and his wife are there temporarily, and they eventually went to Switzerland. But I can give you his telephone number. So she gave me the telephone number, and I bravely rang up. And I think that his wife answered, and she said, how did I have the number? And I said, because, yes, who gave it to you? Of course not. I said, well, I had it, but I can't remember the person's name, or who it was. And I got out of it. And then she suddenly went away and came back. She said, oh, come to lunch. I thought that was very exciting. So I went over to Beaulieu, not far away, to lunch. And he was in a very ordinary flat. And curiously, I didn't realize his one interest was butterflies. That's the last thing I knew anything about butterflies. And he was crazy about butterflies. He used to go out catching butterflies. And when I looked at the room, I thought, good gracious, I can't see any place to photograph Nabokov. Everything was very ordinary in the room. I couldn't find. Then I suddenly saw the mirror over the fireplace. So I stood on a footstool, and I thought he wouldn't like it. And I said, will you look into the mirror? And I took him looking into the mirror, because the room was simply, there was no focal point. So I was trapped for a moment. I didn't know what to do. And then he told me how his son was a conductor, I think, something very musical. Very curious. But, then his great interest, apart from the butterflies, great interest was dictionaries. And I suddenly had a brainwave. I said that I come from the Gaelic-speaking Highlands. And he was very interested that I knew about Gaelic. He hadn't got a Gaelic dictionary. But he was very interested in dictionaries. Butterflies and dictionaries.
And another person that you met in the south of France was Graham Sutherland, who painted those wonderful pictures of Morn and church.
Graham Sutherland, who I went to photograph, lived at that time in had a villa above Menton. In fact, they lived in Sussex, no, in Kent, but they were nearly always out there. And when I went to see him then, he just finished the Somerset Maugham's picture, I think it was, and I was met down in Menton, and I was motored up by someone to this villa. He lived in a very modern villa by a very well-known French architect who did modern houses, Corbusier. He was very well-known. And they had even rented this for some time. He had the most delightful wife. And also there that day was his brother. I didn't know he had a brother. And he was then working on the designs for Coventry Cathedral. What would it have been? It was bombed, Coventry Cathedral, in the war, and he did the altar or something, I don't know what it was. He was working very hard on this work for the Coventry. And in his studio, he had a little studio in the garden. And so it was rather exciting, because I actually saw the work. And he was, I always say he's one of the awful word nicest people I ever met. He was an extraordinarily nice man. And when I looked at those hideous pictures of Somerset Maugham and Churchill, I couldn't believe that such a charming man could produce such horrid work, such unkind work. And his early pictures, were beautiful. I didn't know them until I went to that villa, because he had a few there. Lovely, lovely, lovely early work. He did not portraits so much, but scenes of country scenes. And they were both delightful. In fact, I'd like to get in touch with his widow, because she's still alive. And that was an interesting day. But he had a great charm. I don't know what it was about his idea of charm. You can't describe it. He was a very, very, very delightful man. But it was so odd to see those ugly pictures and this charming man. They didn't go together.
Can we move now on to what was known as the Happy Valley set, and the Earl of Errol, Jos Errol, who was involved in the great scandal out in Kenya?
But somehow I didn't know anything about that part, that rather terribly sordid epoch going on. I only knew I knew Lady Errol, you see, whose mother was the wife of the Lord Errol who was shot. And they, of course, were separated by then. But I did meet, who did I meet now? I met a Miss Caldwell in London in the early days. And she was the one who was the cause of all the excitement out there. Right. She was there, but she was a very ordinary girl when I met her. And then she died not long ago.
I was led to understand she had beautiful blue eyes and blonde hair.
I can't remember, but I remember she was sort of someone I'd looked at but didn't realize what she was going to become.
Yes.
You see? Yes. But no, I wasn't really in with that. But when I was in Austria one year, Lady Broughton, that was the divorced wife of Sir Davis Broughton, who I suppose to have shot Lord Errol, I met Lady Broughton quite a lot. Her daughter is the present Lady Lovett.
Oh, right.
Yes. So of all that set, Lady Lovett, people don't realize, is the last one left, you see, because her mother's dead. Her mother and father were separated, and I used to meet Lady Broughton quite a lot. And then, yes, but I didn't really know much about it. It was so very, very sordid at the time. So sordid that it was rather revolting to read about.
I'd like to go back about do one or two things.
About 4 minutes, 6 minutes.
Right, I was going to say...
Back to what now?
Well, if I give you this line about the landed gentry...
I can't think what can you say about the landed gentry.
Stranded.
Yeah, what can we say about
No,
that?
I was just going to say, Brodrick, you basically came from the Scottish landed gentry...
Landed gentry, yes.
And went into photography.
Yes.
It wasn't the done thing for offspring to go into photography, was it?
Well, I don't suppose it was a done thing to do film work or anything. It was supposed to be rather common, I think. But then when I did those things, everyone said, of course I knew he could do it. But when I was going to do it, they all put me off by saying, dreadful idea. But at the moment, they were always frightened, one's family were always frightened one would do something to discredit the family, I think. See, my cousin Naomi Mitchell is a wonderful example of that, because she shocked everybody from the moment she started. Naomi always absolutely shocked everyone the whole time, because she, for instance, would come in the room with no shoes or stockings on, which is absolutely unheard of, and she had very bad legs. But she was the one who got away with it, you see. But when I started doing my sort of things, they were anxious, you see, that I wouldn't, not disgrace the family exactly, but draw attention to myself in an unsatisfactory manner.
Well, Naomi really took London by storm.
Oh, she was wonderful. I can't tell you, I keep on saying I admire certain people, but I can't tell you how I admire Naomi, because I think the most wonderful thing is intellect. To think that woman's intellect, at 96, her brain, she may be losing her memory, but she's got this marvelous brain. Do you know how many books she's written? I've something like 80 or 90 books that woman's written, and had endless children at the same time. I said, but how could you possibly, Naomi, have written all these books when you were having babies? And then she took up politics. Naomi could work in a room with people talking. She could sit down, I've been in the room, she has an old-fashioned typewriter, 4 inch bits, and she'll sit down and hammer away at her portable, but everyone's talking and she's writing a book. But I couldn't write a letter with people talking. You know what it is, it's concentration. If you have the art of concentrating as she has, she cuts herself right off, you see.
Did you see a lot of her when you first went to London?
Well, not a lot, but she had the kindness to ask me. She was living on the Thames, you see, next to a writer called A.P. Herbert. She was living on the Thames, so when the boat race happened, her house was right in the front row, you see, grandstand. So sometimes I was asked on boat race days to go to the house. And when I went there, I don't think I met anyone very sensational, actually, at the time. But gradually, then her husband, who was a Labour MP in the Midlands, suddenly he had a great, very keen fisherman. So his great idea was to start get somewhere in Scotland to fish. And Naomi wasn't the least keen to go to Scotland, although her grandparents lived there, but she wanted to be in London because all her friends were there. But her husband bought for a very small amount of money Carradale in the Mud of Kintyre, with the result that it was for fishing entirely. So, and to get there in those days, whenever it was, you had to go by boat from Glasgow. It was quite a journey. So that's how Naomi came north eventually, because of that. Then she began to love Carradale. And to this day, she loves it. She just loves being at Carradale. And that's where she did a great deal of her work. But during the war, you know, she did a lot of war work. She went all over the islands to do with the Highlands and Islands panel or something. But her energy is extraordinary. When you see, she's a person who's very calm. I think the art is she's very calm and collected. She doesn't get excitable. And I think she's got great reserve. And she works, you know, in longhand when she starts using that typewriter. She works in longhand a great deal in notebooks. And when she comes to stay here occasionally, I had to meet her at different places in Edinburgh. One day I had to meet her outside the Academy in Princess Street, the RSA. And I went along with all the noise of Princess Street, and there she was sitting on the steps of a notebook, writing. She was writing on the steps of the RSA. I mean, nearly bring out that notebook anywhere. And I think it's extraordinary.
She still goes off to Africa?
Well, she's not, no, she's had to give that up. She's had to give up being the queen of the tribe. She's had to give that up because, well, I think the family were rather nervous about her going, although because she flew, it was quite easy. But I was so anxious that one day she'd get eaten by them. They might have turned on her and suddenly cooked her. But then somebody said to me, but you'd be awfully tough. About newborn lambs. It's a horrible story. You know, one thing I'm going to say about Morn, I never understand a man who'd been so successful and had given so much pleasure could look himself so miserable. He just took a picture of misery. He looked a terribly unhappy man after giving all that pleasure to people.
Okay. On the subject of Somerset Maugham, what were your reactions to him? How did you see him?
Well, you see, when I saw him, he had really, I think, his brain had gone, rather. And so you couldn't make contact very easily. And when I said to him, oh, I see they brought out a new edition of your book, whichever one it was, he said, your guess is as good as mine. That was the answer I got. So you couldn't make much contact with him. The conversation was rather tricky because he just didn't seem to register.
Did he have much of a social life?
Oh, terrific, yes. I never know how he had time to have this social life when he was working so hard. And in Monte Carlo, you would have thought at that age, he was 89 when I last saw him, you would think he wouldn't want to go out to lunch with these rich old ladies, and people gave these rich lunches. And you would have thought he wouldn't have bothered. But the funny thing was that he liked going out, but he wasn't a great asset, because he didn't make jokes or talk very much. But he went with his companion, you see, he went to all these lunches. Then it was the winter season he went. In the summer, I don't know what he did.
Wasn't this how he got his stories?
Oh, yes. Well, he had this companion in the early days, who, of course, I never saw. And they used to go off together, as Morn did up to the end of his life, travel all over the east, wasn't it, they went. And even his companion, who used to get the stories, often passed them on, you see, to Morn. But I think that man was a great help to him, that companion, for many years.
And then afterwards it was Alan Searle.
Yes, but Alan Searle wouldn't have had quite the nous or the intelligence to have been helpful over his work. I think he didn't, by that time I don't think Morn needed much help. I think he was writing books that didn't need so much sort of research. But the curious thing is, as I say always to myself, how could he look so miserable, Morn, having created such wonderful success of his work and given people so much pleasure? How could a man who'd given so much pleasure to the public look so utterly miserable and dejected?
You don't think he was just very unhappy at the end?
He was very unhappy, but why should he be unhappy?
Maybe his private life, his love life.
But he became so, and against his own daughter he became nasty.
Yes, tell me about Cyril Morn.
Well, Cyril Morn I met long before I met Somerset Morn. She was doing her decorating in London, and I went to the opening of one of her sort of exhibitions, and this great idea of painting everything white, which didn't seem to be very original, and also in this climate seemed very unsuitable, but she painted every room white, and I think the furniture was white, and everything was white. It was very monotonous, and Margot Asquith said one day, looking at Mrs. Morn's work, "I think, dear, you want a few maps on the wall." I thought that was it did need something, I must say.
Didn't she do up a famous house for Margaret, Duchess of Argyll?
She did. Margaret's house belonged to her mother, you see, and after her mother handed the house over, and her father went to live in the house, then Margaret did get Cyril Morn in, but I don't think she did a great deal. She didn't go in for white or anything.
I thought they had a white room there.
No, Margaret didn't have a white room, no.
Right. But Cyril Morn started a decorating business quite early on, didn't she?
Very early on, and she was always terrified. She said to me always, "Well, they're going to copy me. They're going to copy me." But I don't know, people weren't inclined to copy white walls. I don't understand what she got rather. She was a woman with no sense of humour. It's the first thing I notice about people, is if they've got a sense of humour. If they haven't a sense of humour, I'm finished. I can't do it with them. And she had no sense of humour.
She was a very rich woman in her own right, wasn't she?
I didn't realize she was. She was the daughter of Dr. Bernardo, and she married a man called Wellcome. Wait a minute, am I right? Or was Dr. Bernardo? No. She was, yes, Wellcome. She married a man called Wellcome first. And then the question was, perhaps a curious marriage, I don't know what happened. And then she married Somerset Maugham. But it came to the end, the Wellcome marriage.
Yes. And she had a daughter by Somerset Maugham,
yes. But there was yes.
Right. It is, yes.
Oh, right.
Yes. Brodrick, can we do something talking about your following the season round in the 30s? I know I keep going back to.
Yeah, I'm trying to think what did happen in the 30s.
Well, no, I wasn't so much thinking that, but I mean, I want your sort of feelings about how you personally reacted to it all, because in the 30s you had
I don't know where I was.
You know, you suddenly found yourself, you were torn between two situations. You know, you came from an establishment Scottish landed family, and you suddenly found yourself being a photographic hack, if that's the right expression.
Yes.
How did you reconcile the two things?
Well, it's just another. You had two lives.
You was having to earn a living.
Oh, yes, certainly. But the thing was, when you look back, one was very badly paid for all that hard work that one did. I may have had free hotels and free tickets on the railways and all that sort of thing, but really one got not very much money, you know. But it did help me to know people, to meet people who I would never have met normally, in the ordinary way. So that later on, I could get in touch with them and photograph them in London. You see. But the trouble long ago very much was this, that the same people went, as I think may have said before, the same people were at St. Maurice every year. So it was only the war broke it up, really. It was rather monotonous.
How did the season then work at that time?
At which time?
In the 30s. What was your average year?
Well, the great idea was the opening of the London season was the opening of the Royal Academy. Private View. Private View at the Royal Academy was generally about the first week of May, and that was the time that the London season, so-called, began. And it went on until Goodwood, which came at the end. When was that? And then after Goodwood, people either went abroad or they came to Scotland to see.
Yes.
Yes, the opening of the Academy is very smart, especially before the war, it was very smart. And to go to the opening of the Academy, well, it was something. And I used to go And of course, you weren't allowed to take photographs in Burlington House. But I used to take photographs outside a great deal. And once I got to an exhibition at Burlington House, which wasn't the opening of the Academy, but it was something very important, and there was no press allowed, and I was allowed, but no other press. And when I came out, the photographers were waiting to photograph the people as they couldn't come in. They were waiting for them to come out, and I came out, and there was a howling noise going on. And this friend of mine said, "Whatever's the matter with all those photographers howling out like that?" It was me, because I'd been in and they hadn't. And they went, "Oh," they booed me, you see. And I was so scared to walk through that courtyard of Burlington House, I thought I'd have my camera snatched. But I kept very close to someone I knew well and walked through with them through the crowd. But they were very hostile.
What about things like, was Queen Charlotte's Ball going then?
It was. I don't think I ever photographed Queen Charlotte's Ball. I don't think so.
But it was mostly private parties.
Yes, I may have. I don't think I did, though.
When you then set off, you say that they either went to Scotland or
yes.
went abroad.
Yes.
Was there a pattern for you when you went abroad?
Oh, certainly. It was to do with the papers. It was like the winter, for instance. You had to get to St. Moritz for Christmas, because the pictures wouldn't have come out for another, a certain time. So when you went to St. Moritz, there wasn't any snow. It was too early. It was dreadful. You generally found you had to do things. It was always an anxiety whether there was going to be any snow, even in St. Moritz, which is pretty high. So the papers expected to get the pictures, whatever happened, after the Christmas session. But there was always a pause, talking of the winter, there was always a pause between the Christmas holidays and going to Switzerland, the families going to Switzerland. They all went back to school, you see, the children, so in January. So there was a lull, for instance, always in Switzerland with the families who went back for the term time after the holidays, and there was a sort of pause. And then it started again, and the best time in Switzerland for me was really March, was January, February. End of February. February was the season in St. Moritz, February, and March even.
When did you get to Monte Carlo?
Then I used to go down to I went to Kitzbühel in between times. Sometimes I went, only in the winter it was, I went to Kitzbühel while I was in St. Moritz, because perhaps it was a good moment, I was told it was a good time to go, and I'd go there for perhaps inside a week. Then I come back to St. Moritz, and then I go, eventually I'd go down to the south of France. What would it be? March. I went to Vichy one year, which is very boring. I used to go down. I didn't come back to this country. I went straight from Switzerland down to Monte Carlo. Yes. And that would be and that was, I think, the really smarter time. You see, in the summer, with even then the tourists, south of France got just rather rabble. I mean to say, very crowded out with tourists. And Cannes was very sort of second rate in the summer. And Monte Carlo remained rather exclusive even in the summer. But yes, so once I didn't come back sometimes till after I'd been to the south of France, which would be Easter time.
You stayed in smart hotels and...
Well, it wasn't so much the smart hotels, it was just lucky that the Hotel de Paris in Monte Carlo, like the Paris Ritz, had such a wonderful reputation. Even today, I think, it still goes on. And it was very nice to be able to stay there. This idea of living free had complications. For instance, one's telephone calls were twice as much. And you had to, the concierge was a great person in my life, the concierges at all the hotels, because they used to give me news about things, and they had to be well tipped. And then living I always impressed me in Monte Carlo that one's bed linen was changed every day. And it was lovely, though, after going through the working day, getting awfully tired of it all, to be able to escape to one's bedroom in the evening and ring a bell and order your meal. I thought it was wonderful.
And this was all paid for?
That was all, yes.
And basically, you would book into the hotel and then you'd find out who was in town?
No, well, talking of, say, Monte Carlo, one took it for granted there always would be those people there at that time, wherever they were.
Yes.
Like the old King of Sweden and all these people, all went the same, they all went. In the summer, Monte Carlo life centered on the beach. It does even much more now. So in the summer, in Monte Carlo, the casino, not the Communal Garden public casino, but the Salle Privé, was very exclusive. But in the summer, it all moved to the beach. So the beach hotel and the casino went down to there's a casino down on the plage, down on the outdoor dinners, wonderful gala dinners, all outdoors on green dance floor, all lit up. So in the summer in Monte Carlo, it all shifted out of Monte Carlo down to the beach.
And you got access to go and take photographs?
Oh yes, because that was the idea. I'd stayed in the hotel to Paris, but you got into the bus in the morning and didn't stay in the town at all. You went down to the beach all day. And that's where most of the photographs were taken.
And travelling around Europe, following
yes.
the socialites, did
yes.
you really feel like the girls that followed the American fleet?
I didn't know how. One took it rather for granted in a funny way. What I really enjoyed was when I was in Monte Carlo, in the summer, I could nip over for the day to Eden Rock, to Antibes. So I could do Cannes and Monte Carlo simultaneously without moving my luggage, as it were. And I used to go backwards and forwards in a rather quick sort of train there was. I used to go over for the day and come back in the evenings.
Did you never feel embarrassed about things?
Very frequently, I should think. I don't know what sort of things do you think.
Well, I was just thinking, when you're, as you say, you were doing a job.
Yes.
So you see somebody that you want to photograph.
Yes.
Heavily in conversation, and you move in and you photograph them. Of course, you get used to it, I suppose. But did you?
I had to wait a great deal because I was extremely shy, you see, and I found. My patience got good. I'm not a very patient person, but I had to wait sometimes ages for people to disengage from their conversations without having to go up to them. We had to wait. We had awful how to wait so long, waiting for people. And then there were people. I was a very well-known film actress, so I can't remember who it is now. It's gone on my head. And she said that she'd come down. She'd come down. It was the winter in Closter. She said, "I don't want to be photographed, but I'll do help you. I'll come down." And she kept me waiting for 2 hours and never came. I went out the back door. But that's the sort of thing one had to put up with.
Yeah, did you find people avoiding you like that?
Very often it wasn't them. It was their boyfriends or their husbands who put them off, I think. But the people were very inconsiderate, also extremely considerate, but they were very inconsiderate sometimes, keeping you waiting in the cold, and with no intention of helping you.
Did you find people...
I was going to say, can I ask, did most of these people have much grasp of the real world and reality, or were they completely cocooned by this artificial life?
No, I don't think they were cocooned at all, especially after the war. No, it was only just that as I keep repeating, there was always the same people doing the same things at the same time every year. So when the war came, it was rather a relief. It broke it up, I think.
But did you find in those days that the kind of before the war, you tended to find your very wealthy aristocratic people leading this seasonal existence of wealth and privilege? After the war, again, it was the same people doing the same things, but they were a different type of person.
Absolutely. Always going back to St. Moritz, after all, which was a great centre, like Monte Carlo, the place became full of Italians, for instance, and they came up in buses, which they didn't do in the early days from Italy. These people who come up in buses. And so it did change a great deal after the war, the clientele.
But again, they before the war, they were identifiable grandees.
Yes, yes.
Whereas afterwards, they were more middle class.
I suppose, really, one sort of accepted it all. But...
or new money, put it that way.
Yes, I did. Yes, but tell you what, the Greeks came a lot, you see. Like the Onassis lot. When the Onassis practically took over Monte Carlo, was that... Onassis, he practically took over the place. The Monaco family were put away. I mean, he didn't look at them. Even when Grace Kelly came, the Greeks very much took over Monte Carlo, so it did change the society very much.
Yes, and the British weren't going there so much.
Well, I think they perhaps couldn't afford it, really, because it was very expensive. But when you think of Onassis, whatever date it was that he came, and his yacht was the biggest yacht and everything, he got more attention and brought people into the society of Monte Carlo who were quite a different lot, you see.
Did you never see it as a very superficial existence?
Of course one did. And one got almost rather bolshy sometimes. I mean, it was so... it was horrid, really. When certain people gambling a lot of money and throwing their money about, it was rather revolting.
Yes, and you could look at this in a very detached kind of way, but
yes,
you
yes,
came from
yes.
An established background yourself, and you could see both sides. I mean, presumably
yes.
you came across the struggling, war-torn European
yes.
remnants, and then this tremendous vulgarity and this tremendous wealth. But of course, some of them had tremendous style, and some of them had no style at all.
Well, it was the older people who had the style, oddly enough, you see. It was the older women, for instance, had great, and the men, in the old days, there were some men, very stylish men in the pre-war days, who went to Monte Carlo every year, very old-fashioned, very sort of high collars, stiff collars, and they were very smart, and went out with a silver-topped cane. But that all stopped after the war. That didn't happen. But there was, the style was never it was the winter season. I'm thinking of the Riviera. The winter season was the time of style, really. The summer wasn't so smart.
And in between this, of course, you came back to Scotland yourself on a regular basis.
But I didn't, at one time, I really came very much less, because I only came up just before the war. I ended up perhaps in Venice, and that'd be September, end of August. And then by September, when the games and open balls started, then I came up then. But sometimes I didn't come up for quite a long time.
But you did a certain amount of photography in Scotland.
Oh, yes, you see, I used to photograph the open ball, or balls there were then, two nights, and portrait of 2 nights. I used to have, portrait was the first. They began in Skye. The portrait balls were always early, end of August. And then Open, they were always the same dates. Then you had Open, 2 nights and 2 days of games, which was my favourite one, because it was near my home over there. And also, it never changed. The Open games, even after the war, it's extraordinary how the same people were still going then.
You can go back 60 years of social gatherings, really, which you've been...
When I went, my mother said she went to 21 open balls, I think, 21 opens, but that was long ago. But I went regularly to Open because that's where one's friends went, you see. And today I think it's very much probably the same, and I don't go because they don't like photographers anymore. And so I can't go, I wouldn't go to Open now. Anyhow, the grandstand got burnt down. I think it must have been sabotage. And they now have it all, don't they, in a tent, the daytime. But the balls were very interesting.
Very grand.
But I took my first flash photograph of a ball at Oban, and that was really quite something, because people didn't really like it very much. They got used to it.
Yes, I've always wondered, because a lot of these balls nowadays, they're rather snooty about having their photographs taken.
Well, especially,
in your day.
Yes, especially in my day, because of the flash bulbs, you see. Now you have cameras which don't need flash bulbs, so they don't know it's happening. But when I was doing it, not with explosions, and one thing and another, there was a commotion. So it's not very... Well, people, as a matter of fact, some of the older generation were very sad when I stopped taking photographs of the balls, because they used to love looking at the pictures in the papers.
Yes, because of course they publish the lists of the house parties even
yes.
today, I think.
Well, the Open Times always did, but I think the Open Times have stopped doing lists now. Yes.
So there's no real record of it.
I don't think they only do the sporting side, which is what they really should be doing, I suppose.
Yes. Yes. Can we go back
yes.
to the occasion when you were with Mary Latter and you saw Peter Townend?
Oh, yes. That was just shortly after he'd married. He was a very good skier, you know, and I can't really remember, but he said he remembered meeting me before what he called the chase. And I couldn't think what the chase was. It was Princess Margaret. So I must have met him, because he remembered me, and I was in Villars, not very far from Lausanne, where a lot of British people always went for skiing. And I was sitting in the big foyer of the hotel, and Mary Latter was with me, and she was very quick at seeing people. And she said to me, "Don't turn round, but you're going to get a surprise in a moment." And I didn't turn round, but suddenly out of the corner of my eye, I saw Peter Townend and his wife, who I'd never seen, walking, they weren't staying in the hotel, walking past, and Mary said, now pull yourself together, don't delay, go and get hold of them now and ask if we can photograph them tomorrow. She was very good at making me get on with it. So I felt rather a bit shy, and I went up to him, and he was delightful, he was so helpful, and I think I told a frightful lie by saying I was working for Harper's Bazaar, and I thought it sounded better than whatever it was, the Daily Mail or something, and he said, oh yes, I'll meet you, we could meet tomorrow morning on the slopes. And so we said 11 o'clock it was, and then they disappeared. They were staying in some chalet, actually, not a very grand hotel, they were in some sort of small chalet. And I noticed that she looked extremely like Princess Margaret. It's funny. She was the same sort of type. And so in the morning, Mary Latta rang me from her room and said, you're finished, you won't be able to go, it's a thick fog. Out of the window, sure enough, was a thick fog. And she said, you'll never turn up, you'll never turn up. However, the fog lifted slightly by 11 o'clock, and we went out. Mary would come with me because she wasn't going to miss it. And she came, and we waited, and we thought, oh goodness, he's not going to turn up. Suddenly, there he was. He arrived with her. And it's rather helpful having Mary with me because they could talk together. And while they were talking, I could get photographs when he wasn't looking at me. Because the great idea of most magazines, especially daily papers, was not to have the people looking at the camera. So we had great time, and I took the photographs and had to rush them, the spools, to Geneva Airport, which wasn't very easy because Vila was quite a long way from Lausanne, and from Lausanne you had to go on to get to Geneva. So eventually I got to Geneva Airport. It was very inconvenient, as I say. Right, and it was an arrangement. They went on the plane, and then I used to ring up London and say there had been four spools at London Airport in 2-3 hours, and they sent a man on a motor bicycle to collect the spools. And so we all waited with bated breath, and sure enough they came out. The pictures came out. And I was very excited. Luckily for me, we were leaving the hotel, going back to Lausanne, on a particular day when the papers had just come out. And unknown to me, after they appeared in the British papers, and I think they appeared also in the Italian papers, poor Peter Townend was obliged to leave Vila because the press arrived in such a way that he had to leave. And I wrecked his holiday, but I never saw him, you see, to apologize for it, having said I was working for Harper's Bazaar. But anyway, it was unkind, I suppose, really, but still, it was my work, wasn't it?
One jumped ahead of the paparazzi.
Yes, but the thing was that I believe he really just had literally to leave.
Well, you must have found this actually on 1 or 2 occasions if you photographed somebody and they knew someone was there.
Yes.
The hordes would. You managed to get the exclusives in a lot of cases because you had the access to the people.
Sometimes, of course, foreign photographers stole a march on me because they had. I suppose they appeared, for instance, in Italian papers, but didn't really kill the English ones. The English results.
I want to go back again to your getting your first camera. You were first given a camera.
It's very hard to remember that because people talk about photography today, they'd almost invented it. But when you think of the long ago days, every house, practically country house, had a dark room in it, and they all took photographs like anything, very good ones. But we all took photographs, but I had a box Brownie, which was the most extraordinary lens it must have had, because they came out so very well, and the films in those days weren't very fast. But I took my early photographs on a box Brownie, and when I look at them today, they really weren't bad at all. So they must have had very good lens. And then, at that date, all cameras had bellows. They opened it, and the bellows were pulled out the camera. It was on a bellows system. Sometimes the bellows, unknown to you, got the holes in them, so the light got in. And you couldn't think why our photographs had marks on them, on the negatives, because the light was getting in through the bellows. But the trouble with the roll films, which I worked on, was there were only 8 on a spool on my camera. There were only 8. You were always on number 8 when something exciting happened, and you had to rip it quickly and change the film. Then I learned to have 2 cameras, you see, and then eventually it took 12. To this day, I think my Rolleiflex only takes 12. So you always had to have two cameras because you were always on the last number when something exciting happened, you see.
You had a bit of a problem with focusing at one point.
I don't know how it was, because I didn't wear glasses and didn't need them in those days, but whether it was sort of not being quick enough or something, I can remember you generally had to be 10 feet away, 8 to 10 feet from people, to be really sure that you were right. And so I thought I said the thing quite correctly, but evidently I didn't. And I had got into such a nervous state about this distance business that I used to go up to people and say, "Do you think I'm 8 feet from you?" They thought I was mad. So, because I didn't quite know what 8 feet looked like. And eventually I got used to it. But I don't know why I had such trouble, but I did. And the next thing was that one of the editors said, "Look here, go to Hyde Park, because there are a lot of sheep there just now, and go and practice on the sheep to learn your focusing." And it's quite true. I went to Hyde Park to photograph the sheep. Some of the subjects were all like sheep.
Right. Can we... I just want to fill in a little bit more about going back to Margaret again.
Yes?
I think we've covered quite a lot about Margaret, but when did you last really see her?
In this flat. Would have been... She came sometimes at Christmas because she had nowhere to go, really, you see, because she couldn't go to Beaver, to her daughters, so she really had nowhere to go, and that's when she came here. But I'm trying to think, the last visit, I don't think it was Christmas. But the curious thing was that when she was here, she never went to a shop. The most extraordinary thing, Margaret never went out to shopping. I don't think she did in London.
Did she carry money?
Never. I don't know what she must have had money somehow in those days, well, certainly. But she didn't. When I went to the cinema in London with her, she didn't ever had a car of her own. Her father's car sometimes. We went in the taxi to the cinema, and I paid for the taxi. We got out, and as we got out, a man would come forward with an envelope, which he handed to me, and those were the tickets. So we didn't queue up at the box office or anything, but I think it was all on an account. In Margaret, everything was put down. And then, once, she was terribly punctilious. If she was going anywhere, she would bang on time. In fact, one morning, I had to leave here with her at 8:30 to motor north to do something we were going to. And she was ready, quarter of an hour before the 8:30. She was ready on the dot. She never kept you waiting. But the thing about, we were talking before, about what was about, before I said that, about being late, punctilious. Well, she also she never carried money visibly. I can remember that. And I never saw her go. She never went shopping here, but what she did was, once she kept me waiting, which is very unusual, and I was sitting in the London house waiting for her, and she came in rather, not breathless, but rather in a hurry, because knowing she was late. She said, "I've been to Harrods," as if you'd been to the zoo. So funny, wasn't it? She didn't sort of go shopping much.
I always got the impression that every time she went out, it was like she was stepping out onto a stage.
Yes, you're right. But you see, she was, as I say, a perfectionist. Therefore, everything had to be right. It didn't matter where she was going. Everything was, gloves were perfect, everything was perfect. And when she was here one day, we were rather loose end, and I said, "Oh, let's go out." And it was in the afternoon. And she had on, I don't know what she was wearing, she said, "I can't, you see, haven't got the right gloves, and they might see me." And I didn't like to say, "Margaret, who are they in Edinburgh who are going to see you in India Street, not with the right gloves?" It's very curious, wasn't it?
She was at one stage, she was supposed to be the best dressed woman in the world, wasn't she?
Awful label to have, I think. She was beautifully dressed, yes, but then she had this wonderful frame, you see, that wonderful shape, wonderful figure. And I can remember when she moved into Grosvenor House to a flat, or she'd never in her life lived in a flat. When she first lived in Grosvenor House, it was very small, and the spare room was entirely given up to her clothes. And her clothes were kept rather like in a shop, on hangers. You see all her things covered in cellophane, but there are long hangers of clothes covered in cellophane, not in cupboards. And then she had rows. Her shoes were like a bookcase, shelves of shoes, and that was all in the spare room. But I said, Margaret, do you have a lot? Long ago, I said to her, do you have a lot of clothes? She said, yes, a great many. She used to say. Latterly, she cut down a great deal, I think, on her clothes. But she always looked, I don't know, better than all the others.
Did she bring her poodle here?
Never, no, never. She didn't have a poodle. In the early days when she was in Inverara, she had rows of spaniels and all kinds. She called them the Mayfair boys. And she brought her dogs up to Inverara. But she didn't have, not here, no, there's no question of that, ever. Not at all.
A famous one called Alphonse.
Yes, they all, I used to say, where are the dogs? She said, don't call them dogs. She said, they aren't dogs. It's Alphonse or whatever it was. She used to have quite a few, but when there was no question of her having dogs here at all.
But she was very fond of her animals, really.
Well, you know, I'm afraid I said that she really only loved two people, and one was her father. She loved her father, who I remember very well. I didn't know her mother. And she loved animals. Now, when you went to Inverara in the early days, it was quite a long way to go, and sometimes a friend of mine, we were together, and we wanted some tea. And when we got to Inverara, she used to suddenly say, oh, I'll get the dog's tea. Never ask if we wanted tea. And then I said, oh, Margaret, could we have some tea? Because she never had tea. Could we have some tea? She said, of course. But she never remembered. And in came the tea. The dogs had tea. Still, we didn't have anything. It was very curious. And you remember the Tobermory treasure, that the Duke of Argyll had a say in that because of the owning land in Mull, what was it?
Mull, yes.
Yeah, right. So when I was in Edinburgh once, they were doing this treasure hunt. And I went there, and Margaret said, oh, I'm afraid for lunch we've got a salvage man. I thought, a salvage man to lunch? That's very odd. The salvage man was an admiral. What had to do with something very important. It was at Inverara, at Tobermory, helping about the treasure. And she said, a salvage man. I thought of some little workman was coming to lunch. It's very funny. Oh dear, yes. I'd mentioned she loved going with me to the tattoo in the festival, and she loved sitting on those hard wooden benches. Well, you would think she wouldn't have liked it, and she adored bagpipes.
Really?
And she used to almost cry. She loved the bagpipes, and we used to go to the festival and sit on those hard seats. And she luckily didn't pour rain. She didn't mind if it rained. She had this marvelous, very smart Macintosh or hood she could put on. But she was very tough in a funny way.
Okay.
Oh, we're okay. Because, did you get that bit? No, I was going to say, Margaret was very conscious of her Scottish origins, wasn't she?
Yes, she used to say, looking so elegant and extraordinary, unlike Scotland in a way, she said, I am a Glaswegian. Really less like a Glaswegian to my mind, I could hardly imagine. But she was very proud of that. Yes, she was indeed. And you know, she loved America, because as she was taken there, well, she was 3 years old, I think, when her father went to America. She really was brought up almost in America. That's why many people thought she was American. But she loved going to America. She loved New York. I think she nearly lived there. She nearly gave up London one time.
When she came to stay here, you took her to the tattoo.
I did, and she loved having what she called a good cry. And she got very moved by the bands and everything. She loved it. And I thought, so unlike her, to sit on a hard wooden bench, rather cold. But she loved it. But the thing I always wanted to do in London was to get Margaret onto a bus, because she never had life went on a bus, or the underground. I thought it would have been wonderful if I could have taken her on the underground or the bus.
Well, when she came up here, I think remember, she went to look for her ancestors in Ayrshire.
Ah, yes, you remember that. Well, she went to look for her ancestors because They were down, I can't remember, was it Sanqua? Where's that place called?
That sounds right.
Sanqua.
Yes.
Well, they were buried,
The Wiggums.
The Wiggums were buried at Sanqua, and she suddenly got interested in the idea of going there, and she came especially to stay for that. And we went down, it poured rain, and the man down at Sanqua ran, unknown to us, ran a wonderful museum there. And he hoped the Duchess of Argyll was going to write a big check out, I think, for the museum. So he paved the way for us to go, and when we got down there, we hired a car, went down. When we got there, we found he'd ordered a very nice lunch for us in a hotel. He didn't come for lunch. This man who was going to show us the graves, he, very clever of him, he gave us, let's have our lunch on our own. Then he appeared immediately after lunch, and we went to this graveyard. It was interesting, but the graves were in such a state, there's nothing worse than an untidy graveyard. And I saw the back of it all. He was hoping she'd pay towards the upkeep of the graveyard, because it needed, there was lack of money, you see. And she was very keen about her ancestors, and you know her family went back a long way. She on her, which side, her mother's side or her father, I can't remember. Anyway, the point was she was very keen, and this man then added that he had this museum. And after we stumped around the graveyard and looked at the very badly kept graves, we then went to the museum. We had a cup of tea with his wife in the house nearby. Then we went to the museum, which is very interesting, the Sanqua Museum. It was in the old toll booth. And there again, I had an awful suspicion he was expecting a nice big check. But alas, we went away having given no money to anything.
Of course, people did assume that she was phenomenally rich.
So she was. She had, I'm told, Margaret had, when her father died, and I can't tell you what date it was, she had nearly 3 million.
But she did do quite a lot of things. She gave money to...
She did. Bleakholt.
Charities.
To Bleakholt, the animal sanctuary. Because a friend of mine said, you must do something for people. And she said, I hate people, but I like animals. So the idea was that she'd go to this place called Bleakholt, which I went several times with her. I've forgotten what county it was in. It was Michael Thornton, the writer, who was a great friend of mine, of course, and of hers. And he suggested that she should help the Bleakholt Animal Sanctuary, which she duly did. And she gave quite a lot of money to this. And every year, she was very businesslike. Every year she'd go up there, 2 or 3 times a year she went. And I used to come down from here by plane to meet her into Manchester. And I met Margaret and Michael Thornton in Manchester. They came up by train, and she paid my air ticket on the spot and everything. And we went to Bleakholt. And she took great interest. And then, you see, as time went on and the money was going, she couldn't really do much for them. But she did an enormous amount of good for those at the animal sanctuary. She really saved it.
Yes. Sorry, I'm just thinking about this for a second. Did you keep in touch with her right until the end? Because of course she had to move out of Grosvenor-Hurst, didn't she?
Oh, well, that took a long time. Unknown to me, you see, I didn't know she hadn't paid her rent. I knew nothing about these things. And I didn't realize that she hadn't paid her rent for something like 3 years. But her maids kept leaving. When she had one old family maid who came backwards and forwards. Sometimes she was there and sometimes she wasn't. The family maid got to be over 80. And then she had great difficulty in finding a suitable maid, and also the maids didn't get on very well. I don't know what it was, but she had great trouble. You know, it's an extraordinary thing to say, but she didn't know how to make tea. When she was here, you know, I made her make tea. I made her wash up here once. And you know, she was very efficient. And then she said to me during the washing up, she said, after all I did in the war, work in a canteen.
Well, that's not generally known.
No, but I'll tell you what the extraordinary thing was. She could do anything very well if she chose.
Yeah.
You see, for instance, washing up, she washed up rather well. It's extraordinary, she'd never done that sort of thing. But she could adapt herself.
Did you see her at the time when she was friendly with Paul Getty?
Oh yes, but I didn't. The lovely story was Paul Getty had a bodyguard always, and Paul Getty used to stay with Margaret in her house there in Upper Grosvenor Street. And the story goes that Margaret went into his room and found Paul Getty on all fours looking under the bed. That's the story. See, Getty was under the bed. The bodyguard wasn't quite sure the bodyguard examined the bedroom.
He was a bit paranoid, we'll understand.
Yes, yes.
You didn't go to Sutton Place?
Hmm?
You didn't go to Sutton?
I never got to Sutton Place, but Margaret gave a birthday party for Paul Getty, a birthday party he didn't want, really. And that was towards very much the end of his life, and she gave it at Grosvenor House. It was very enormous. It was the last party I ever went to, she gave a wonderful party. And I wasn't asked to the dinner, ever. I came in after the dinner. And I was to take photographs, but there was some mishap. I've forgotten what happened, and I didn't take the photographs. But she gave us a wonderful party for Paul Getty with a huge birthday cake, which was wheeled in. And I don't think he hardly turned, they didn't turn up. I don't think he wanted a birthday party at all.
Quite a shy man, wasn't he?
Extremely, but you know, like Somerset Maugham, age had done something awful to him. He didn't seem to be with it at all. And so I didn't know what to say to him, except that he used to stay up near Inverness with the Maxwell family. And when he stayed with the Maxwells, he used to do all his telephoning in Inverness, because his telephone bill was so astronomical. Paul Getty arranged that he'd be motoring to Inverness every day to do his telephoning, to save the Maxwell telephone bill. And so I thought I'd mention the Maxwells. He didn't register at all. I said, oh, I've been brought up practically entirely. I was brought up with the Maxwell family, but he wasn't interested. He didn't react. He was very, as I say, rather like Somerset Maugham, who didn't really make much sense.
He didn't give you the impression he smiled very much?
He never smiled. I remember even in photographs, he never smiled, ever. He wasn't that type of person.
But this, of course, was, this would be in the 60s, wouldn't it?
I'm very bad at dates, without looking at my...
Yes, I think this would probably be in the 60s, because, of course, you know, you continued. Why did you come back? What I really like to concentrate on is, you know, you had the 30s and the 50s where you were travelling around. When did you actually give up doing the circuit?
Let's think. It must have been to do with the war. When the war came,
after the war.
After the war, the circuit. But I suppose I came to live here in 1965. At that time, I was still going to Lausanne. I suppose it was to do with magazines.
Why did you come to Scotland?
Well, in London, I had this flat, which in long ago days you couldn't buy, but I had it for many years, and suddenly, after the war, before '65, you see, they decided to put up rents, it was quite cheap before. So the rents went up, it's getting rather too much, and so it was like a lease came to an end, that was it, and about in '64. So I got very worried, and my great friends, the Maxwells in Edinburgh, said, as you're always coming to Edinburgh and staying with us, why don't you live in Edinburgh? And I said at the time, nothing will make me live in Edinburgh. I must be in London. And at that time I was going less to Lausanne. And so I didn't know what was going to happen quite. But I was here in April, and I had to get out of the London flat by August. And so the Maxwells, Ursula Maxwell, said, oh, before you go back to London, because I was staying with them here in Murray Place, before you go back to London, there are 3 flats advertised in the Scotsman this morning. Why don't you go and look at them? And I said, I really don't want to look at any flats in Edinburgh. And I made rather sort of against the idea. But I did look at the 3 flats, and this was the 3rd one I looked at. And although it was derelict, absolutely derelict, I thought there was something about it. One thought one knew Edinburgh pretty well, but I discovered there's windows, for instance, the original windows, and the whole thing was, and after London, the space and everything. I didn't think about the heating. And then, without telling my brother, I said to the man who was here, he was living here temporarily with a family, and sort of camping out, and I said, I'll give you I'm not sure. He said, it's 4,000. I thought, what a lot. And 4,000, I thought it was an awful lot of price. So I didn't tell my brother, but I said to him, I give you my telephone number. I didn't give him my address for some reason. I said, I give you my telephone number, and about a month later the telephone rang in London, and I was luckily in, and there was this man here who said he'd had another offer which wasn't good enough, and would I still like it for 4,000? So without asking my brother or anything, I said, oh yes. And so then that's how it happened. But I'd had to have gone somewhere. But I don't think my brother would have financed London for me, because he never went down to London. My mother was there, of course, a great deal of her day. She lived in my flat when I was in Switzerland. But there was no reason to have a London establishment except for myself, and that was going to be rather expensive. So my brother, I don't think, would have agreed to putting any money into it in London. And so he paid this money for seeing the flat for 3,000, was it? I said 3,000? 4,000, and then it was 4,000 at least to do it up. So that was 8, wasn't it? Yes, 8,000. And it took a long time, you see, to get it finished. It worked. The workmen, in those days it's wonderful, because the workmen didn't, now they only do something by an hour, you know, what business, it's all different now. The workmen came here and stayed all day. But now it's so much an hour, it's terrible.
That's right.
Yes.
But really, you came back to Scotland when it was all really, that whole era was changing.
Must have, though, because there was no necessity to be in London. And my Mary in Lausanne, she died, you see, about 7 years ago. And even Lausanne was getting to, well, I never thought ever it would come to an end, that house, ever. Like I didn't think the Queen of Spain was going to die, sort of thing. But it all ended, there again, it all suddenly ended, you see.
Yes.
That life.
And a whole generation.
When the Queen of Spain died, the whole thing stopped in Lausanne. Women bought their clothes for the Queen of Spain's parties, and the whole thing centered around the Queen, you see. And as we were next door with the Queen living in the garden, it made a tremendous. I mean, anything exciting had happened, the Queen would tell us anyone grand was coming, and she'd come over to us a great deal. I got some tips from the Queen of Spain she gave me a lot of tips for the papers by mistake, not knowing, because one day she came to tea, and we were alone, and Mary was pouring out the tea, and suddenly the Queen said, "Now, dear," she said to Mary, "I've had such a nice letter from the Queen Mother this morning." My ears, I thought, what's going to happen? I'm very excited. Mary looked at me, and the Queen had had a letter from the Queen Mother to say that Princess Margaret and Tony Armstrong Jones were going to live in Kensington Palace. In, as the Queen said, my old home, because that's where the Queen Mother lived, Princess Beatrice. And I got the first news of Tony Armstrong Jones and Princess Margaret going to live in Kensington Palace, you see. Well, I couldn't wait to get to the telephone. And the moment the Queen had left, I got on to London at once. And the excitement was intense in London, because it was the first news, you see.
Didn't you sometimes feel a little, rather like a spy?
I'm afraid so, yes I did.
You quite enjoyed it?
I wouldn't say I enjoyed it, no. But that was quite an excitement. And then I went back to London by chance. I had to go anyway, about 2 days later, and they sent dispatch riders from the Fleet Street and asked me all about the palace, where the kitchen was and where everything was. And I was meant to go on the back of the motor bicycle to show them, we would drive past there, to show them what was what. But I didn't do that. But it was a very small house, you could see, they went to first, because that was where where Lord Carisbrooke lived. There was the Queen of Spain's brother, only surviving brother, Lord Carisbrooke. He was a widower at that stage, and he lived in Kensington Palace, in Kensington Palace, you see, and then that is where they went to live.
Did that sort of thing ever rebound on you? When you,
but no one knew I'd given that.
It was you?
No. And also I got a scoop on Noel, you see, going to live in Switzerland, because I knew the house.
Yes, I see.
And Chaplin also. You see, it really was Switzerland to help me.
Switzerland was really your vocal.
And then you were saying, what was I doing at certain times? Well, it really was Switzerland took first place.
And then everything turned out when somewhere became fashionable, that's
yes.
where you went.
The last excitement you see at Lausanne was the Queen of Spain's 80th birthday. After that, things went down rather, because she didn't live very long after 80th birthday. And then it, as I say, it all stopped rather. And Mary sold her big house and lived in a smaller one. And then you see that she died.
What happened with Mary's husband? He was presumably around all the time.
Oh, certainly. You see, her first husband I only met in 1938 when I, for the first time, really met Mary. A lady letter, her mother said, "Oh, if you're going to Venice," it was in 1938, "you will find Mary's there with her child." And when I got there, that's when I first met her, and she was very helpful. And then we never met again, you see, for a long time, till after the war. So Mary was in Venice in 1938, that was, yes. And that's how I first saw her.
And then she married...
No, I was going to tell you, yes. She then had her first husband, who didn't speak English very well, and he was Marquis de Cramayel, and they had this one son. And then he was there, his tutor. And the Cramayel went on until the end of the war. He died. He wasn't very old. He died at the end of the war. And Mary was only a widow a very short time. She was a woman who couldn't really be without a husband, in the sense that she couldn't have a meal by herself, for instance. She always had to have someone at the other end of the table. We used to have trays upstairs, otherwise we were alone. What happened was, about 3 years later, she married Nicky Chevaldon-Traig, who was Comte. She went down a peg. She went from being a marquise to Comtesse. And Mary wouldn't take the coronets off her handbag for the Marquis ones. And her second husband was furious because she didn't change it to the Comte ones, you see. I can always remember, as if anyone noticed. But he was, the second husband, charming man, he was the best man at her first wedding.
So they'd been friends, huh?
Yes, and so it was rather like me. She'd known him a long time, and he never married anyone before. And his sister in Paris said, "Why don't you marry Mary?" Because, after all, she's going to be alone. And Nicky thought it a good idea. And so they got married in London, and that was how it all happened. But she'd known him always, you see.
And was he around all the time that you were there?
Oh, very much so. But he got awfully fed up with all this English talk. Although he did come to England more than her first husband did. He got awfully tired of us talking about English people, bored him stiff. And he said, "I'm so glad now," around. He used to say, "I'm so glad you'll come. You can occupy the Countess." Because occupying was, we talked about London. And Mary kept the most wonderful scrapbooks right up to the end of her life. She took out of the newspapers, not just people she knew, but anything interesting. But she was a wonderful editress, because she edited the books so cleverly, like the royal weddings and things. All of these wonderful volumes. And I do hope they're being kept by the granddaughter.
She kept tabs on everything.
She did, and she knew every family she talked. She knew Mary would know who had the best tiara in Britain and all that. But she wasn't intellectual, but she was very, very quick-witted, quick-minded, very. She's a great influence.
Yes.
And he knew he'd one day be a baronet, because his grandfather lived to be 101, I think, and then he became a baronet. But he was made, eventually he was made
Can we get
a life peer.
on camera? But
Yeah.
what was it? This was a confrontation you had with him?
But, as a young boy, for some reason his parents didn't feature much. They lived in London. But as I say, he always knew one day he'd be a baronet. And somehow he never had much social support. And when I took my early photographs, he used to rush towards the camera. He loved being photographed, whether it was in Switzerland or in London. He always liked being photographed. So I got very used to him. Then he got married and went to live in Mull after his grandfather died. And I took photographs of him. He got a bit difficult by the time he went to live in Mull, because he was in the army and it wasn't done for him to appear too much in the newspapers. So he wasn't desperately keen to be photographed at Duart Castle, Isle of Mull, and all that business. He wasn't so very keen. She didn't mind, but it wasn't very easy. Then suddenly he became head scout, chief scout. And so he was abroad a great deal, and I didn't see much of him. He had a son and a daughter, but then he disappeared rather out of my life. Then he comes back from being chief scout, and suddenly he gets in touch somehow with the royal family. I don't know how it was. He suggested that he should be, what was he in the end? I can't remember. Lord Chamberlain, right. But before he became Lord Chamberlain, the royal yacht used to pause at Duart Castle in Mull, and they used to go ashore. The royal family used to go ashore to do it. So he got to know the Queen. In the Boy Scout days, he got to know the royal family. And so eventually, he suddenly became, not suddenly, but he became Lord Chamberlain, which was a wonderful leg up, you see. Well, from the moment he became Lord Chamberlain, he became absolutely odious to me, because I can't tell you why, but wherever I was, he'd say, "What's Brodrick Haldane doing here?" And he tried to make it very difficult for me. In fact, though she's a widow, and I knew her very well before she married even, I said I really could never forgive him. Ships McLean, I'd never forgive him for the way he treated me when I was working. And anything to do with the royal family, when I was photographing anything in Edinburgh, and he was there, he always said, "What's Brodrick Haldane doing? Has he got permission to come here?" And people used to stand up for me. They said, "Well, we've asked him." But he was very, I don't know what made him like that, but he was very, he may have been, he died, I don't know why he died, but he might have been ill, really, for a long time, for all I know. But he was horrid. He was so horrid, he was like that Aga Khan. I mean, he was a thorn in my flesh.
But you got on, your relationship with the royal family was very good.
Well, I didn't have much relationship with the royal family. Only Princess,
there was never a problem.
Princess Marina I knew very well, but I don't think I really knew the royal family.
But I remember
not much.
photographing the Queen.
Oh yes, I photographed the Queen, yes.
Queen Mother.
But, and the Queen Mother, yes, certainly. But then lots of people did that, didn't they? No, but Ships McLean, I never know why he was so unkind. Really unkind and horrible.
Were there others like that?
Must have been several others, I think, and I'm trying to think.
You must have developed a kind of defence against that sort of thing, because you must have come across it. I think you've got to be quite detached when you're doing the kind.
Yes, well, the funny thing is, the curious thing is, was that I'm terribly sensitive to this day, you see, and I never know, looking back, how one stood it. I suppose you had to stand it. Do you see?
Yes.
You couldn't answer back. I find it very, very difficult. In fact, often when I was in those big hotels, it was terribly lonely. Because one didn't want to talk to all those people all the time.
Did you not find that, you see, you were, to the onlooker, you were having an exceedingly glamorous social life?
Mm-hmm.
But how did you reconcile that with your actual private life as yourself? Because, as you say, you were very lonely. You were seen at all the right places. You knew all the right people.
Yes.
And yet you were an onlooker a lot of the time.
Well, it was very nice, of course, really, to be an onlooker, because you had to keep up appearances to the extent that once you'd finished your work at a hotel, you could disappear to your room and not come down again till the morning. I didn't have to sit through tedious dinner parties or anything, unless I was asked. And I found it was a great blessing. And I always keep saying about the Hotel de Paris in Monte Carlo, it was like my second home, because it was wonderful to live in that lovely hotel and shut the door away from all those people and get into this lovely room and not have to be bothered about all that social side.
Did you make friends with other photographers? Or
there weren't very many photographers to be friends with, I don't think, at that moment, not abroad.
You took a rather nice photograph of Cecil Beaton with a snowman.
Oh yes, that was not so long ago. Of course, I suppose 1965 I came here, so it's after 65. I saw him now, on and off, you see. He was at Harrow with my brother, but my brother Alex was younger, so they didn't have much contact then. But I knew him on and off in London. But one year, yes, he came to St. Moritz. I didn't know he was coming. And he was staying with some of those, not Greeks, I forgot, or Onassis people, somewhere, in a chalet. And to my amazement, I saw him in the village street. And he was all dressed up in skiing clothes. They all looked terribly new, and even the boots looked sort of very new. Everything was new. And I said, oh, I hope I can photograph you. He said, he loved being photographed. So I arranged to photograph him. And they always had in St. Moritz, in the square, the village square, every year, wonderful snowmen, huge, gigantic snowmen, beautifully made. And there was a terrific, that year, there was a tremendous snowman. And I thought, I will get into the Daily Express. They'd like that. With Beaton, the snowman, you see. And so I arranged, when I met him at the Palace Hotel, we walked up to the snowman, and I said to him, oh, I think this is such a good idea. Let's take the photograph over there. And I thought he might jib at that, but he didn't. He said it was quite a good idea to photograph the snowman. So as we were walking up, it was very icy, and he slipped. And I thought, my goodness, don't tell me he's going to break his leg. And he fell on the ground, and I thought, good heavens, I've got to get any photographs now. And I got him up, and he was all right. And we went on, we walked up to the snowman. And so I took this photograph, and it did get straight into the Daily Express, because it was rather original of him as a snowman. But he didn't like when I said to him, would you look sideways, because always like the Express and the papers didn't like people looking at the camera. So I asked him to turn sideways, and he said, I don't think I'm very good sideways. And I got him to turn slightly sideways, and I took the photograph. But I thought he'd broken his leg that day. It was awful. Well, then, that was that, and then he disappeared. No, he didn't disappear. A day later, he was still about, and I don't know where we met, somewhere in the street, I think, and I went for a walk with him, and he was carrying his Rolleiflex, just the same as mine. And as we were going along, I wanted to put a yellow filter onto my lens, because it helps with the clouds and the snow. So I stopped for a little while to put the yellow filter on. He turned to me and he said, what's that? Honestly. So, with a Rolleiflex in his hand, I said, it's a yellow filter. What are those? He said. Well, how could he not have known? It's ridiculous. So I said, well, it helps with the sky and everything. And he said, I must get some of those. But I mean, perhaps absolute rubbish. You can't tell me he didn't know what a yellow filter was. And then he took a photograph of me. I don't think it ever got used in the paper, I don't think. He took a photograph of me. But I love when he's holding the same camera as mine, not to know about yellow filters and about those sort of things. Of course he knew. Of course he knew.
He was winding you up, in fact, was he?
I mean, really, I don't know. He always sort of pretended he didn't know if the camera was loaded or not, sort of thing, you know.
Was he quite a deep person, or was he?
Well, I used to see people always said how amusing he was, but I don't think he thought I was worth being amusing at all, because him being amusing with me, because I think he didn't try with me. He knew me pretty well, but he wasn't going to sort of put himself out, I don't think. I didn't find him very amusing. He was very hard, and he was terribly tough. I can't tell you how tough he was.
Quite vain.
He was very vain, but he was very tough. My goodness, he was tough. Hard as nails underneath.
Was he ambitious?
Oh, I think they had been always ambitious, yes. He made his name on his sisters, you know. Long before, after he left school, his sisters, his father was had a certain amount of money. He was to do with timber company. And he had these two very nice sisters. Beautiful. They weren't very beautiful, but they were attractive. And a brother who actually killed himself. Well, the sisters had to come out one day, in due course. They had to come out in London society. But the Beatons weren't known, you see, in those days at all. And really Beaton's work started launching his sisters.
Because you see, in a way, there's a parallel that he came from, actually, in effect, you came from a more distinguished, established, landed gentry than he did.
Stranded gentry.
That's right. Yes. He came from a well-off English family.
Yes.
And he was doing more or less the same sort of thing that you were doing.
Except you've got to remember he could draw. It was bad. He drew badly, but some would say he looked as though he drew badly on purpose. He had talent, you see. He could design for the theatre. He could design sets. You see, he could do all those things. Apart from taking the photographs, he was very accomplished. Yes. Very accomplished.
So you must have overlapped a bit at the start, because would he have been doing the same kind of...
No, not at all.
Social?
See, he worked not so much. He did so much for the theatre. In fact, any money, he made a lot of money, like My Fair Lady, for instance, he did all the clothes. His real income came, I think, from the stage, going to New York for the opening of these plays he designed things for. No, I think he was a multi-talented person, very touchy and difficult, but I don't think he had very much affection. To my mind, it's very easy to get wrong impressions, but to my mind he was too hard. I don't know what, they said I never had meals with him, they said even the food wasn't very good in his house. He was rather stingy in a way, I think.
Well, probably he had to, certainly to begin with, to make ends meet like everybody else. But he started with portraiture rather than you were...
Oh, certainly. But he started honestly, with the same camera as I had, until Condé Nast's Vogue realized he had this talent, and they made him use a Rolleiflex. No, they made him use a big camera, which he hated using. He went on using a Rolleiflex right to the end of his life. In fact, he took a lot of those pictures of Prince Charles as a baby and Princess Anne with the Rolleiflex, like mine. But he had a great advantage, you see. Working with Vogue, he could get a team of assistants. When he did any royal photographs, he had many assistants round him. They plugged the lights in, and they read the light, and all he had to do was to let the thing off. You see, he had great help. You see, great deal of help. And but there was something, awful thing to say, unattractive about him, really. But everyone thought he was very amusing.
You never thought he was glamorous?
Not glamorous, no. You didn't give me my golden nose, she said, which was like ugly nose. Now let's see, what is there else? I'm sure there's some story that you've left out.
I was going to touch on Violet Trefusis, because you photographed her.
Oh yes, I had a lot to do with her, a strange woman. Yes, a lot to do with Violet. Just think a moment. You remember that one, and now I think it might be somebody else you've left. On Sundays, which I don't think he ever wrote, but his name was on it. He was a great friend of Beaverbrook's, and I think, and very badly off, and I rather think that column, he just gave his name to it. It went on a long time, actually, the Castle Ross column. But I didn't know, I photographed him playing, he used to play golf, oddly enough, although he was enormously fat. Yes, I photographed him playing golf, but never met him. Never met him at all. I didn't really know Beaverbrook very well. He signed himself the Dragoman. For years, Dryburgh column was signed the Dragoman. That's right, thank you so much. And then he put his name to it, his real name. And then there was a woman. Now, what was the woman? She did a column. Lady Eleanor Smith, when I was at school, was the daughter of Lord Birkenhead, and she wrote books always about the circus life. Her novels were based on the circus. And Lady Eleanor Smith never married, and she wrote from a window in Vanity Fair in the Sunday something Dispatch. So she was the first woman I can remember, Lady Eleanor Smith. And, she went on quite a long time. Lady Eleanor Smith. Now let's see here who there is. Melina Mercuri, Constance Bennett, Douglas Fairbanks, Jr., Charlie Chaplin, Margaret Leighton, Linda Christian. Argyll was that one. And he called himself the Dragoman in those days.
He didn't have anything very much to do with it.
No. And he was then signing himself the Dragoman. He became that other later. Let us see who's here now. Lillian Gish, Judy Campbell, James Robertson Justice. David wrote endless books. Never stopped. Murray McLaren, Lady Cynthia Asquith. We needn't wear Lady Cynthia Asquith. Not violently interesting. Erich Marat Remarque, he wrote All Quiet on the Western Front and married one of Chaplin's former wives. I can't remember which one. Trevor Roper, Osbert Sitwell. There must be others. Claire Sheridan. Well, she was Churchill's cousin, and she went to Russia to interview the Bolsheviks. It was unheard of. She went in the days of the Bolsheviks to sculpt the Bolsheviks in Moscow. A fearful row about her going. I'm just trying to find somebody who might be amusing. Very exciting. I think that's very exciting. Wendy Wood. Mary Lisco, Dean Ing. Dean Ing, you see, was a great character. He'd been Dean of St. Paul's, and he was known as a pillar of the church, which he really wasn't, a pillar of the church and 2 columns in the Evening Standard. Because Beaverbrook was very cunning and got hold of Ing. I think we've got the best of the lot. Then the girl who became Queen of the Belgians, that's not very exciting. I knew her, little knowing she was going to become the Queen of the Belgians. She used to write my captions for me. Lady Mansfield, Beveridge Report. No, I don't think we've got much out. Doesn't look like it, does it? Peter Fleming, who I think was much more interesting, his books sold very well. He went off and did wonderful journeys on. One's book was called One's Company, and he went all off alone to these strange countries. And then a woman went with him on other expeditions. And his brother, who's horrid really, that other one whose book sold so well, that horrid brother wasn't heard of then.
Why was he horrid?
Well, he was a nasty type of person. He was arrogant and rude to people, and he was an unpleasant character. And he married only once, yes. But he was not very nice at all. Unattractive man, I suppose, very. Margaret refused. It was very strange. Well, she was the girlfriend, you see, of the Vita Sacra West. And I went to her. She lived in her mother, you see, was King Edward VII's mistress, Mrs. Keppel, Mrs. George Keppel. And Violet did have a marriage with Trefusis, but it wasn't really a marriage. I don't think it lasted very long. And then Violet could write. She lived in Florence, I say, in her mother's house. She could write in French and English as well, equally well. She was bilingual, you see. For some reason she could write her books in French or in English. And I went to see her in Florence many times, and once when I first went there, and I didn't know the house very well, she was sitting in this lovely room with a stone floor. She was smoking a cigarette, and after a little while, the cigarette burnt down, she threw it on the ground, lit. So it was very odd, and I picked it up. She said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm picking it up, just leave it alone," she said. And in a little while a footman came in and swept it up.
You see, somewhere hidden.
I think they still.
Very.
Oh yes, yes.
Subtle and
yes.
underground. Did everybody know what was going on? Was it all very hush-hush? Or?
Well, it was meant to be hush-hush, but King Edward VII, you see, had endless mistresses, really, and when he went to pay visits anywhere, he was always put with a communicating door going to the next room. Nearly always.
Well, this was all kept very discreet.
Very, and King Edward always had a cold chicken in his bedroom every night in case he felt hungry.
Or his mistress felt
Yes. He always had a cold chicken. Who told that? I can't remember.
But then morality was a very different sort of thing in those days.
Oh, yes, yes.
When you were working as effectively,
Mm.
a latter-day paparazzi, as
Yes.
saying, you know, nowadays, your job, if you were working nowadays, would be to try and take compromising photographs of, well, you talked about the Argyll and
Yes.
girls. But of course, it wasn't like that when you were doing it.
But I could never have done that sort of work. First of all, I didn't have a telescopic lens on my camera, and which we had to have really. And I don't think I'd have cared for doing that sort of work.
And of course,
Writing
the
is
whole
different.
secret of the way you were able to operate was the fact that people knew you to a very great extent. They trusted you, they recognized you.
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose if you actually undermined that trust, they'd see you coming in on a mile. The very fact that you were allowed to into parties was the fact that they knew that you were going to take a certain style
Yes.
of picture.
Yes.
Is this something what do you feel about the modern context of it, the way that people operate nowadays?
Well, I mean, it's rather sort of, everybody gets photographed doing everything. I mean, there's no, see, there was a sort of mystique before when people didn't have things photographed so much. People had never seen inside their houses until someone came along and photographed the rooms. Before that wasn't done, you see. Not because of burglars, but they just didn't expose themselves to publicity of that sort.
There'd be a great deal of curiosity about the Madame Lupescu's of this world.
Yes, but it's amazing how many people don't remember Madame Lupescu, because you see, King Carol's been dead a long time now, and some people don't remember too young to remember her.
I wonder if Romanians know that, I mean, she was the woman that brought down the throne.
Of course she did, yes. But this woman who was supposed to poison people and got them shot and everything, when I looked at her, she was so commonplace, I couldn't really believe that she'd ever gone to those lengths. But she had, as I said, an allure about her. I don't know, very bedworthy, I suppose you'd call it.
Yes.
But
did you find that actually about the sort of great mistresses?
I didn't know how many mistresses I ever photographed. Not very many, I don't think. Not many. But
I mean, it does intrigue us that, you know, the way that you have, you know, what do you think the sort of the spark between Violet Trefusis and Peter Sackville-West? What was the attraction between the two?
well, first of all, I knew nothing about that story until the war came, and Violet Trefusis hurried out of Florence and hurried to her mother, who was in Paris, and then they came to London and lived by hand to mouth at the Ritz. And then I heard the story about her life, but I didn't really take it in the early days, because she never saw Vita Sackville-West really after that affair stopped. I don't think she saw her. In fact, Harold Nicholson, Vita's husband, well, he didn't want to see Violet Trefusis anyway. But during the war years, Violet did go back to Sissinghurst, where she'd never been, to see Vita. But the curious thing I think about Vita Sackville-West was how she got all her work done. When you read all these goings-on and how she ran off to France with Violet Trefusis, but her books seem to come out. I don't understand how on earth they had time with all this drama going on. I don't know how they had time.
It is a little intriguing. You see that the sort of, you know, the response of the reaction of your generation towards this kind of morality, and then the fact that her son, Peter Sackville-West's son, then writes a book about his parents' marriage.
Yes, yes. I was in the army, you see, with Ben. That was her eldest boy, who died. But Ben and I were together, and both of us not knowing one end of the gun from the other. And but Ben was curious. he had some Spanish blood through his, you see, Vita's, that gypsy strain that came to Vita through her mother. Her grandmother was actually a gypsy, Vita's grandmother. And the boy, Ben, who was with me, he had this curiously Spanish look, whereas Nigel, who I didn't know, at present the only one left, the brother, was very ordinary. But Ben was quite Spanish looking. He didn't look British at all, and so it came down to him, rather.
I suppose the whole thing, I mean, in a situation like the Windsors, you would never have got a situation where somebody would have been able to take a topless photograph of the Duchess of Windsor.
No.
You would never have
No.
lived that kind of life.
But
it was a lot more sophisticated, the general way, because I suppose they lived their lives as if they were constantly on show anyway.
yes, but it does always puzzle me, even today, how people get their work done when they're having these dramas. I just don't know how it's done, because I think they just shut everything out for so many hours it is, or weeks in the week, I don't know. But how do they get things finished when they're having terrific things happening to them, their love lives? And
well, I suppose love lives are part of everybody's existence, but
it must upset your mind, I think, rather.
this is perhaps why Somerset Maugham looks so unhappy at the end of the day.
Yeah, possibly, yes. It could be, yes.
Mind you, he had a succession of secretaries.
Yes, yes.
I suppose because they went everywhere with him.
But the next curious that Vita Sackville West said long after the Trefusis affair that no one had ever told her about such a thing as homosexuality.
Yeah.
She didn't know it existed. She didn't know what it was.
Had she not? She must have.
She didn't.
She must have read The Well of Loneliness.
I can't think what it was, but she actually did say that at that time she didn't know what she was doing was sort of rather, I don't know.
Unusual.
Yes, she didn't, and it's very curious.
It was actually, it's a sort of very much they always say that the Beaton is very much a kind of passionate friendship, which a lot
Yes.
of people probably had, which
Yes.
nowadays is interpreted as all sorts of other things.
But it upset that situation very much upset Mrs. Violet's mother, Mrs. George Keppel, who had been, as I know, King Edward's mistress. But so I think her mother was very upset. Violet's mother was very upset socially about that going on.
I suppose there'd be lots of whispers. And there wouldn't be nowadays. I mean, nowadays it would be the front page of the Sun, but you see in those days.
But Vita's mother, who has all that Spanish blood in her, was absolutely eccentric to such a degree. She lived at Noel, you see, with her husband, and Vita was the only child, a great disappointment being a girl, and I think they'd been living at Noel quite a long time, of course, when suddenly Vita's mother, I think they're about 15 or so, Vita's mother one evening went upstairs, packed, and left in the morning and never came back. Left her husband, just went away.
Where did she go?
She had a house at Brighton, and she never came back. She suddenly took it into her head to leave.
I suppose in those days,
No wonder Vita was a bit peculiar. But she had this awful, strange mother.
I suppose in those days, you see, of course, you're talking about people who had other houses to go to.
Yes.
It wasn't the sort of problem.
Yes, yes.
Nowadays, if somebody leaves somebody, there's a great fight about who owns the house,
Yes.
the children, and all the rest of it. In those days, people were independent enough in that level of society to just basically do what they wanted.
Yes. Vita's mother was so eccentric, was unbelievable. And she got money out of 2 or 3 enormously rich men. Enormous sums of money. I don't know, she took them, they took to her so much. She was, I suppose, fascinating. But she had an enormous amount of money coming in for all these sort of boyfriends. I don't think it was love affairs were going on, actually, but she had this great attraction. And one day, Vita's mother was in a taxi, and she had £1,000 in notes or something, and she left it in a taxi. She was absolutely extraordinary. And then she said to Vita, "Why don't you get a whole window in the bookshop for your books? You ought to have a whole window given to you." She didn't realize you had to pay for that sort of thing. But she was wildly, she almost broke up Vita's marriage with Harold Nicholson, because she was so eccentric and difficult. And then when she lived in Brighton, she thought curious woman, she thought she'd like some flowers. She got an awful lot of artificial flowers and stuck them in the ground in her garden. So when it rained, awful things happened. But she didn't bother about flowers. She stuck artificial flowers in the garden instead. She must, I'd love to have met her. I think she would have been very interesting.
Garden gnomes nowadays.
Garden gnomes. But she was a great character. But these vastly rich men, I think they were mostly unmarried men, somehow she got enormous sums of money out of them. I don't know why, but one man left her a house in Paris, I think. But she must have had what's called something, Vita's mother. But Vita herself had a terribly sad life, because she was a disappointment. You see, they wanted an heir, and of course she was a girl, and she was always conscious all her life that she would have been the mistress of Noel, that lovely house in Kent, had she been a boy. But then, what about the upkeep? How did Vita imagine that Noel could be kept up privately at a huge house? Isn't it possible? And when the National Trust did take it over, by that time Vita was living in Cecil. But when the National Trust did save Noel, really, from collapsing altogether financially, Vita was absolutely livid. The idea of the public going over her home, she was very, what is the word, not practical, impractical,